Hello. I'm Terry. I don't really give a lot of talks, so sorry if this is a bit all over the place. I'm going to let a lot of video do the talking for me, basically. Okay, so I'm going to talk about my main project at the moment. It's a game that should have taken about 7 days to make. I started 6 weeks ago and it isn't finished yet. I started to take a break from bigger projects, and this is kind of a recurring pattern. So, for example, I spent 6 months working on a game called V, and it was also supposed to take a week. Another game I made, Super Hexagon, started off as a one-day jam game. In fact, I rarely start anything that I think is going to take me more than a couple of days. When I do, it often doesn't work out. So a jam game taking longer than planned, turning into a big thing, really isn't unusual. For this talk, I want to talk a bit about why this seems to happen so often. I want to talk about how I work. I'm going to do this by trying to talk about what I actually do on a game from a day-to-day basis, to show how to take an idea step by step towards something from nothing, and the problems that you solve along the way. I want to try and break down the tiny decisions, the obvious decisions, the little things that I think people don't usually talk about, because taken on their own, they don't seem worth talking about. I want to talk about what I do when I make games. So, here's what happened. I decided to enter a competition called 7-Day Roguelike. It's a challenge where you make a roguelike in 7 days. I love roguelikes, but I haven't done a lot of work in that direction. And I wanted to change that. I actually have a big plan. Somewhere down the line, I want to make this big roguelike I have in my head. But I shouldn't, because I don't have any real experience with the genre. So, here's the plan. I decided I was going to make a tiny, scratchy little ASCII game and put it out in 7 days. I wanted to finally put down some of the ideas I've been carrying around into something I could play. I want to figure out firsthand what feels good and what doesn't. The inspiration for this game is purely mechanical, and there were 2 mechanical things that I was curious about. Most roguelikes are all about close-range combat. And I want to know what you could do with turn-based games that explores different types of ranged combat. Next, turn-based stealth. How does turn-based stealth gameplay feel? Stealth gameplay is all about timing. You're waiting for windows of opportunity to make a run for it. Does it even work when it's turn-based? Do you just end up with a load of parity puzzles? And I set out with one more goal: zero polish. Work in ASCII, do no animation, unnecessary visual stuff, which is more than an aesthetic choice. I want to get to the interesting bits of the design as soon as possible. Beyond that, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. Nothing you'd call a plan anyway, it's just a jam game. Day 1. So first of all, I don't start from scratch. The first thing I do when I start a new project is look for things I've worked on before that are vaguely like what I'm going for. And I got old projects for parts. You do this long enough and you end up with a lot of useful pieces. In this case, I found this old thing I worked on last September that ended up going nowhere. I'd already figured out a lot of tricky problems like simultaneous turn-based movement, pathfinding, super useful stuff for a roguelike. From there, I had a simple fresh goal. Can everybody see that? It might be a little bit dark. Okay. I had a simple fresh goal. Make a room that I can walk around in with collision. One of the big appeals of roguelikes is procedural generation, which I've not done really much of anything before. Level design is my favorite part of making games, so I never really do this. Right from the start, I wanted things to be random, not to have any placeholder design content. The map generator here is incredibly simple. It draws a bunch of rectangles on the screen, and then connects them with straight lines. It doesn't do any kind of checking. It often makes loads of mistakes. I'm pointing this out because the level generation code took less than an hour, and it's what I used for the whole first week. Once I'd done that, I wanted to have something else on the screen, so I added my first enemy. This is a guard, which is the G symbol. I set it up so that it walks into a wall, it just picks a random new direction to walk in. I have a guard moving at half the speed of the player. You can move twice for every one move that they take. I did this because as soon as I had it walking around, it was clear that it wasn't fun to have to chase after it. After this, I added a few more tiny things, items that you pick up, staircase that brings you to a different floor. I'm going to start by itemizing every little thing from here on out. Next is lighting. So I had something pretty important to the concept to figure out. The idea is that enemies have this line of sight. If you stay out of it, you can attack them and they can't hurt you. If you step into it, they become really dangerous. Getting this to work meant implementing lots of little technical things, having a different state for the enemies depending on whether they'd seen you or not. And at this point, you run into one of the tiny design decisions that comes up when you're working on something. In this case, the question is, what happens when you attack an enemy who's alert as opposed to one that's not alert? And the solution I went for is to have an extra state. You stun the enemy for a few turns, they go to sleep, and then they wake back up. That's a tiny decision in and of itself, but there are a lot of other ways you could solve that. And choosing to do it this way has consequences. By the end of day one, things were looking pretty good. Avoiding enemies in a turn-based game already turned out to be surprisingly fun, even when it's this simple. I mean, there's almost nothing here, but it's kind of fun to avoid enemies and try to get to the next floor. Okay, day two. Stealth gameplay was just one of the things I wanted to try. The other was ranged combat. So I tried adding a weapon that shot the thing you were looking at. And that meant there were some immediate consequences to the decision I'd made the day before about having a stun state. Until now, if you walked up to an enemy, you killed them, and if you attacked them when they saw you, you stunned them, and then they get back up for a few turns. Now that I've added a new type of attack, it seemed like a natural decision that ranged attack should only stun instead of outright killing them. If I made a different tiny decision yesterday, then it would have led to a different tiny decision today, and tiny decisions add up. Next, instead I decided that collecting items was going to be a thing, I looked for another old project of mine with an inventory system, gutted the code from that. That project happened to have like a different type of equitables. So I set the game up to have two types of weapon. A close-ranged one that you use when you walked into enemies, and a long-range one that you use when you press the spacebar. That's really confusing, and it's a really bad idea. And it took me weeks to realize it. I spent most of the rest of the day working on more weapons and code for things to finish for the next day. Day three. So I spent a while working on a new enemy, a dog. I decided that I wanted my dog, which is just the letter D, to feel more like a dog, so I gave it the ability to bark. Once I'd done that, I realized I could make everyone bark. So I made the guards bark. Then I made them talk, have them say a few random things when they saw you. And getting caught suddenly starts to feel a lot more, interesting. Here's the actual dog. The dog has a different line of sight from the guards. It has like a bubble around it. It also does something different. Once it's alert, it runs to the nearest guard and alerts them. So waking a dog is like setting off an alarm, which gave me an idea. Here's a new weapon, the pistol. The pistol is a long-ranged weapon and actually kills enemies. However, if you use it, it alerts everyone else in the room, like the dog, a bit like setting off an alarm. This makes it really risky to use, like a real last resort weapon, which is really fun. It's my favorite weapon in the whole game. I did a few other small things. This is a drill, which knocks a big hole in a wall that you can walk through. So you can see how I use it here. This is a scanner, which just reveals everything on the map, and a letter, which just shows you some text when you pick it up. I'm not really sure yet what that text should be. Inspiration for this particular game is purely mechanical, but I often find that just having a thing in front of you to play leads to figuring out what it is you want it to be about. Like the game will just tell you itself what it should obviously be. It feels like just another design decision that follows logically from the other design decisions you've made up to that point. Sometimes it comes first, sometimes it comes later, but either way, inspiration finds you working. Day 4. Now that I've figured out the basics, I wanted to start adding more content. I started thinking more about different weapon types, different enemy types. This is the sniper rifle. The basic parameters of my weapon so far are range, whether it kills or stuns, and whether it alerts other enemies or not, which makes the sniper rifle completely overpowered, which makes it boring, so I took it out. This is a new enemy. The first new enemy I tried was this drone enemy that hugs the walls. I wanted to try something which had a totally different movement type and vision type from the other two enemies. If a drone sees you, it alerts everything in the room. This is a robot. It does a few things differently. It knows exactly where you are, and it's always trying to pathfind towards you. And rather than having a line of sight that puts it into an alert state, it has something else, a laser, which damages you straight away. I intended this to be like a harder enemy, but in practice it's actually really easy to deal with. So I made a harder enemy. This is a rook. It's surrounded by a laser bubble, so you can't get anywhere near it. You need to use long-range weapons on it. It moves weirdly. It keeps going the same direction until it hits a wall. The rook is the first enemy I made that's as fast as the player. I figured that would be fair as long as you had space to get around it, but when you're randomly generating levels, that's really hard to guarantee. So it took a while to figure out how to make this one work. Next, I thought it would be really nice to have a really, really hard enemy. So I made this. This is the Terminator. There's a huge laser bubble around it. It pathfinds directly to you, like the robots, and this is the best bit. It has health. In fact, it's the only enemy in the game that takes more than one hit, and it takes 5 hits. And when you kill it, this happens. This is basically set up just to show you. It explodes, and it deals damage to you if you're close enough. It's also the only enemy in the game that can't be stunned. I figured it'd be the last enemy you see in the game, like the uber boss. So things were looking pretty good by the end of day 4. Like, I could really finish this in a week. Day 5. I decided to add a huge procedurally generated overworld to the game. Now, instead of a single level, the game was going to be something bigger. Many levels with a big objective that I hadn't really thought through. Having this big empty space was pretty boring, though, so I decided it'd be more fun if you were followed everywhere by a Terminator. I really believe that I could do this massively, multiply the scale of the game, and still finish it by day 7. Day 6. I took day 6 off. It slowly dawned on me that I was not going to finish this by the end of the week. So I took a step back. I started thinking about where I want to go next. Day 7. I added fire. I decided I was making this bigger anyway, so I thought it'd be cool to have something totally different in the game. And fire, I thought, would make the overworld a bit more interesting. I tried to add rivers to the map, but it wasn't really working because there was a lot of techie problems with figuring out how to generate bridges and things like that. So I figured, instead of rivers of water, why not have rivers of fire? And created entire screens of fire inhabited by fire people. You can make your way through it if you find a fire extinguisher, but the fire people really don't like that. You also make yourself immune to fire if you find and swallow an ice cube. At this point, the game is no longer a jam game that had to be done in 7 days. Now it's just a thing I'm working on. So I stopped keeping track of the days exactly. I keep some notes and builds, but I'm not entirely certain of the time frame from here on out. So I did a couple of small things while I figured out where to go next. I fixed bugs, made nicer fire. This is a Perlin noise thing. I made a plan for where all this was going. So this is going to be a bigger thing, then there were a lot of things I needed to fix. The level generation. I'm still using the same draw random rectangles generator that I made in an hour on day 1. A lot of the basic gameplay problems that the game actually has come back to this. For example, if guards see you out of nowhere, it isn't a problem with how the guards work, it's a problem with how the corridors work. More content. At this point, I have a couple of random enemies, a couple of random weapons. Some enemies kind of work, some don't. Some weapons work, some don't. I figured the best way to solve this was to make a lot of both and just keep the good stuff. And big structural stuff. So there are a lot of questions to answer if this game is going to have a big overworld between levels. What's on the overworld? How are the levels different? How should the infantry work if you're going to play a dozen levels over the course of a game? How do you keep the player from becoming too overpowered as they find new things over a long game? Does it still make sense to have permadeath? Is having a big open world even a good idea, or is this just a big mistake? Still figuring that out. Oh, and graphics. So when I posted about this on Twitter, there was one reaction I got a lot, which really bugged me. Cool, it reminds me of Dwarf Fortress. And it doesn't matter that this game looks and feels completely different. Having ASCII graphics just comes with baggage. So I made a note. I'm going to try something else. Started week 2 with a plan. I was going to make a much better room generator. Here's what I wanted to try. Okay, instead of having big empty rectangles, I wanted to pre-design lots and lots of different rooms and pick one at random instead of just drawing a rectangle, and still have the same thing where you connected these rooms with lines. I didn't think this would take long, but it did. I'm going to skim over the next week of work really quickly. So I started by making a tool for drawing them. Each room contains item and enemy placements, but as suggestions rather than literal places. You also have to specify some connection points for the corridors. And the other part of this process was to have pre-designed room blueprints and make lots of rooms in different categories and then tell the generator exactly how to connect them. An example blueprint would be 4 rooms, an entrance room, a room with an enemy, a room with an item, and an exit room, connected in that order. This took a while. As soon as I had this system roughly working, I realized I had a problem. This is generating terrible levels. This doesn't work. It got even worse when I started distributing items in the level. It went from being a thing that made unpredictable and fun levels to being a thing that made levels that just looked like they'd been designed deliberately but really badly. So you start seeing little details that might have been some part of a construction, like the way there's like a gap where the entrance is, and they don't actually have a purpose because it's just randomly placed. But I didn't want to go back to the simple generator because that had problems as well. Everything is really one note, and if this is going to be a big game, then it needs to be more interesting. I'm describing about a week of work here, doing all this level generation stuff. A week of figuring out better algorithms to connect rooms, algorithms to distribute items, place enemies. And it was a week where the game wasn't fun to play anymore. Finally hit a turning point near the end of the month. I did 2 things. First of all, I decided that the simple empty rectangles were just more fun to play in than these ornate, cramped rooms. So I got the generator to just use those as the basic room shapes. Then I took the pre-designed thing further and made special rooms that I call ripple rooms, like the one where the dog is. These were rooms that had a complete, tiny, pre-designed challenge in them, and every floor has at least one. So finally, at the start of April, I had gotten it to make levels that were as good as the ones it was making on day 1. The last week had really hurt my momentum in the game, so I decided to start adding new content again. This is a new enemy, cameras. They have a big field of vision, and when they see you, they alert all the enemies. Cameras are fun, but they're usually pretty easy to deal with, so I made a harder enemy, a sentinel, which is a camera that looks in 4 directions. It also has the lights around it, so you can't actually get close to it. You can't stun it unless you have a long-range weapon. No, sorry. Finally, I took some time to make a couple of new weapons. This is a teleporter weapon, which is pretty fun to use, but rarely useful. The next thing I did looks pretty dramatic, but actually it's a pretty small change. I do some graphics. So the @ symbol now has legs and arms, which is crucial. Just having graphics didn't change how the game felt to play, but it was really important. I'd gotten to a point where I was almost afraid to change how it looked, so this is a really big step. It's now been 4 weeks since I started. I spent the next day cleaning things up a little, tweaking the graphics, dealing with the actual impact of having new graphics. Since I decided to use tiles that were a little bit bigger than the terminal font I was using, a single screen now contains a lot less of the map. So I made a new plan, put together a simple introduction level where every floor fits on a single screen, which is now running. 4 weeks after I started, I finally had some content that felt like it could be in the final game. Just take a breath and watch some gameplay. Okay. The next day I decided to try doing a little bit more work on the graphics. So I spent some time mocking up some simple things I could do with the walls, like a really simple thing I could do without changing the basic structure of the game. And so here are a couple of random ideas I tried out, just filling the entire map and putting borders on the edges. Trying to do the Zelda thing where every wall is a diagonal. The reason I have to do this is because there are a lot of walls of height 1, so I can't do the obvious thing of just placing a different shade of wall on top of the other. Here's one where I just sort of colour the outsides a bit. And this is basically the one I went for, where the individual walls are very, very thin at the top, so you can do the single wall thing a bit better. I settled on this, basically. I'm going to clean things up, but this is pretty close to how I think the final game is going to look. Okay, I'm getting pretty close to the end, but here are a few more small things I added in the last week that I like. This signal jammer, which only affects the cameras. It affects every camera in the room. I did some thinking about other type of items that would feel pretty different, but basically do the same thing, like a bomb that makes the room safe. With the intention of just keeping the best one. So this item is a time stopper. It stops time for a few turns until you collide with an enemy. It's potentially interesting because you can wait for the room to line up the way you want and then make a run for it, but it definitely needs some tweaking. And this is a cloak, which just in practice feels like the most fun item, so it's probably the one I'm going to keep. One of the most recent things I've done with the game is try to build a new type of level. We're using a different feel from the first one. So I ended up using simple enemies in the first one, guards, cameras, dogs, and I want to try a tower that uses more complicated enemies. So I finally got the rook enemies to work in this new tower by making level blueprints with more interesting choke points. None of the robot enemies actually care about cameras or stealth, so the last thing I did on the game was to make a new enemy, the bomb bot. The bomb bots wake up if you're spotted by a camera, then they get as close to you as they can and they explode. And this makes a pretty good mix with the other enemies that are in this tower. That's it. So what's next? Quite a lot. I have a certain scale in mind for this game now, and I have work to do to meet that. I'd like for there to be 5 or 6 different types of stages in the game, which means making lots of new enemies with some new types of challenges. I have big problems with inventory that I still need to figure out. Basically, item discovery is pretty important for making the player take risks, so I want to keep up the same pace of item discovery that I already have. But that leads to the problem of the player getting too much stuff over the course of the game and becoming too powerful. And I still need to figure out the overworld stuff, the bit between the levels. There are a lot of directions I could go in. I need to figure out the right one. So all this extra stuff to do, I think it'll take at least 7 days. Okay, thanks for listening. I'm going to continue to... Thank you.
If there's any questions, we have to do the same procedure as last talk. You have to run up to the stage. If there's more than one person, you can line up. There's no questions. Yes, come here. If anyone else wants to have a question.
Okay. So first of all, thanks for the great talk. It was very inspiring. I was amazed by the way the ASCII graphics were really communicating a lot. I was kind of surprised when you showed the graphic part because I thought, whoa, that's amazing. It's just letters, but I can imagine what's going on. Would it be maybe nice to include like a switch? So you have like a second skin, and if you want to play the really hardcore thing.
I think I'm probably going to stick with the new graphics, but I have this idea for an item that like turns everything into ASCII for some reason that I haven't figured out yet.
Yeah, that would be great, I think.
Okay.
Any other question? Come up here. Yes.
So it looks like the switch to real graphics was fairly simple. Did you not actually use console-based ASCII art, or did you use sprite-based?
I sort of just had tiles that were blown up terminal fonts.
I see.
I had to do a little bit of work to change the font from like the ASCII terminal thing to use a font that didn't look like ASCII, because everything had been kind of coded into these little grid segments. But that was it. It was pretty simple after that.
Judging from the progress, it seemed the first 7 days were the most motivated. Could you agree with that?
Yeah, totally. I mean, it was a jam. I was basically working flat out. I've been taking it a bit easier since then. So it happens.
You think that tricking yourself approach worked? And
Yeah, totally. I do it all the time. It's the only way I get anything done.
do you think is this now become that like roguelike you wanted to make in the beginning, or is there still another roguelike in the future?
Basically, that project I've kind of talked about is it's actually more of a story thing, and what I'm trying to do is figure out the mechanics that fit with it. So I know what I want that game to be about, and it's a bit more personal and things, but I actually have no idea how it plays. Okay. So that's the purpose of doing this, to figure out stuff that works, stuff that I can play with, and just find the game that way.
Yeah, well, last question. What I really liked was you talked about like you started with the dog, started like riffing, and then you had conversations started to come into the other characters and everything. Yeah. And I was wondering what your thoughts on like getting the text and getting that aspect into the game has on the entire experience.
Yeah, I am thinking about a story direction, but I haven't fully figured it out yet. It'll probably be pretty silly, given the theming of the enemies is suggesting something kind of over the top and ridiculous. So if there is text in the game, it might be like a separate thing from people walking around and talking that way. I'm basically still thinking about that.
In the 868 attack, when you die, you have to go through all the preliminary levels.
Yeah.
And do you consider to have a checkpoint so that you don't have to?
Yeah, that's a definite problem. So old school roguelikes don't care. They do this, right? You go back and you play like Alpha Man or Adam or something, and they're huge. And when you die, you're just dead. But this game probably isn't going to be that way. I'm thinking about maybe having a shop that sells you things like items and inventory, and also like save crystals, so you can choose whether to spend your money on something that powers you up, or spend your money on a save point but then be weaker. There's a couple of different approaches I have to try there still.
Great way to monetize too. There.
With 7 days, you don't have much time to plan. You can't like make a whole GDD or anything. But how do you go from, I think a sniper rifle would be good? Do you doodle it out? Do you kind of try to figure it out on paper, or you're just sitting down on a toilet, get the idea, and then when you're finished and you're clean and shit, just go straight into coding and see if it works? Or
it's different for different games, but in this case, the way I think about it is that there are parameters you can mess with. And for example, with a sniper rifle, you've got, a weapon can shoot a certain range. When it hits the enemy, it can either kill them, it can stun them, it could push them back, it could pull them towards you. You just think of the things that you can mess with and try making variations.
So you don't really need to sketch it out. You just think about it. You look at the code and just try it out straight on the thing.
Yeah. I come up with something I want to try, and then I see how it feels. And like half of it gets scrapped, usually.
One last question. Yes.
Hi. So far, have you been the only one who has been playing the game, the prototype? Or when is the time when you give it to other people?
Unusually for this game, I actually posted the builds on my website, which I don't normally do. So I was getting like lots of feedback on Twitter and things about how people were responding every day, which was motivating for the first 7 days, but like it would have been super unmotivating in week 2 when the game was actually getting worse for a while. So I might start doing that again now that the game is getting closer to finished, because it did help a lot in the first week.
No more questions? All right. Thank you very much, Terry.
Thank you.